thank you all for coming and joining us today. Great to see so many faces. I hope you have all got a seat, so that's brilliant. I'm Geraldine Dening of Architects for Social Housing, and I'll be chairing this event. So the event is part of the exhibition Retrofitting Social Housing, Alternatives to Demolition, showcasing 3 case studies: Wilmcote House by ECD Architects, West Kentish Town Estate by AAB Architects, and St Raphael's Estate by Architects for Social Housing. These form the background to the discussions we're going to be having this afternoon. If you haven't yet managed to have a look around at the exhibition, it's on till October the 11th. The deterioration of our social and council housing estates over the past decades, as a result of managed decline, has led housing associations and local authorities to argue that demolition is the only way we can provide new social housing. As we've seen, however, demolition and rebuilding is socially, financially, and environmentally costly, and relies on the construction of high-value homes for private sale to pay for rebuilding demolished council and social homes. This results in the displacement of existing communities, the privatisation of public land, and a failure to address the need for additional social housing. Shelter confirmed that between 2022 and 23 alone, there was a net loss of 11,700 social rent homes in England. Regeneration through demolition and rebuilding also had significant environmental costs, including pollution, and is a vast waste of resources. On the other hand, the benefits of retrofitting housing estates include improved thermal performance, reduced fuel bills, reduced build times and construction costs, considerably fewer resources, and environmental impact, and most importantly, enable the continuation of existing communities and the retention and increase of our social housing stock. We had a great discussion earlier of the technical and financial benefits and barriers of retrofit over demolition, with a number of interesting policy recommendations. The session was filmed, so you should be able to watch that later date if you want to. For this panel, we'll be focusing on the social and economic impacts and motivations of demolition of social housing estates, the benefits of retrofit over demolition, and some of the barriers to its wider implementation. And we'll hopefully be coming up with some policy or practice proposals. And I'd hope that all of you in the audience, we know we've got a lot of people with a huge amount of experience in the audience, and I'd very much like to hear from you or if you'd like to contribute to the discussion. But I'd like to thank our panel for joining us today. We've got Kate Macintosh on your far left, architect of numerous social housing estates of the golden post-war period and housing campaigner. We've got Tom Keane, artist and now academic, of the Save Cressingham activist and former Cressingham Gardens resident of the Cressingham campaign. Marianne Heaslip, technical director of People Powered Retrofit. Pete Firmin, resident of South Kilburn Estate in Brent, which is the estate not far from St Raphael's estate over there, which has been undergoing regeneration for quite a number of years. And Paul Watts, visiting professor from London School of Economics. The collaborators for the show, Alice and Sam from Alice Brown Architects and Loriana from ECD are also here, as well as other team members and consultants who've worked on the exhibited schemes. So you're welcome to direct questions or comments to all of us during the session today. So in terms of the structure of the session, I'm going to ask the panel to respond to some initial questions and give them the chance to respond to each other. As I said, I know there's a lot of wealth of knowledge in the room, so I'm going to open up to you in the room as well for questions. So, with no further ado, I'm going to start off with Paul. Paul, can you introduce maybe some of the key social and economic impacts of demolition and benefits and barriers, the wider implementation of retrofit within the context of the estate regeneration?
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to draw on some of the findings from my book. There's a shameless plug here, Estate Regeneration and its Discontents, and there are quite a few discontents. I started the book with a quotation from a tenant up in Tottenham. And basically what she said is, don't regenerate my estate, because regeneration has become a nasty word. Now that's actually counterintuitive, because the term regeneration, it means revitalization, renewal, it's like all the sort of positive things in relationship to the transformation of an area, improving rundown areas, providing a better place, providing better housing. So it's actually very difficult to be against regeneration in lots of ways. But what that quote illustrates is the way that in London over the last 10 to 15 years, it is the case that estate regeneration, particularly in relationship to demolition and rebuilding, has become a nasty word. And the way to think about it, I'll use a literary metaphor, is Jekyll and Hyde. So what happens when the local authorities or when the housing associations come along, they come to the estates and they say, look, we're going to regenerate your estates. And basically then they'll say, you know, you're living in terrible conditions, damp, mold, etc., etc. We're going to provide you with new housing. We're going to provide you with much better facilities in the area. It's a win-win. Everybody wins. So that's the Dr. Jekyll aspect of estate regeneration, the way it's presented. And it's sold to residents because they have to get residents' consent. Initially, it was often via consultation, but more latterly, it's been through ballots. But the reality of regeneration, and this is what my book's about. I spent over 10 years interviewing estate residents, attending hundreds of meetings. The reality for estate residents going through this process is it's a Mr. Hyde. It's degeneration. That's what happens to their areas. And that degeneration, so it's a disinvestment and it's a deterioration over and above any of the initial problems that they might have had on the estate. And basically, there are 4 elements to degeneration. The first is physical. So what happens is that a process of managed decline kicks in because the repairs and the maintenance, that deteriorates in expectation that the buildings are going to be demolished. So residents routinely say, we're not getting our lifts repaired. The caretaking services stop. All kinds of things cease. Also, part of the physical degeneration is the way that you will get empty and boarded up properties. So what happens as part of it? Because basically they, in the jargon, decant tenants, leaseholders are bought out. So regenerated, degenerated estates are pockmarked with these boarded up properties, which make the estates look like the sink estates that they're unjustly accused of in the first place. You also have social degeneration, because what happens for any remaining residents is, you know, usually estates in London, they're pretty convivial places, particularly for those people who have lived on estates for a long time. So what happens when the regeneration degeneration kicks in is that tenants are decanted, leaseholders are bought out. So then there's a disappearance of the already existing population, but new people come into the half-empty estate. So you can have squatters, you can also have temporary tenants. And as the actual demolition gets closer, the temporary tenants are kicked out themselves, then you get property guardians. So any remaining social tenants, any remaining leaseholders, they're living in a deteriorating social environment. Then you have what we can call social degeneration. This is something that is simply not discussed by anywhere near as much as it should be. This whole process is incredibly stressful. And one of the points about it is that the schemes that I looked at, 14 schemes across London, these schemes were due to finish in about 10 years, 15 maybe. The reality is that they're taking 20, 30. In the case of the Aylesbury estate, 35 years. In the case of Clapham Park, 35 years. In the case of Woodbury Down, pretty much getting on for 40 years. So residents have got to live through this process for years and years and years. So they have to put up with the stress of living next to a building site, the dirt, the dust, the noise, which actually, you know, I interviewed some people who said, because of the noise that's going on from the building works, they actually vacated their flat. So they're literally unhomed through this process. There's also a process of what I call displacement anxiety, because people are worried about where they're going to go, when they're going to be moved, what kind of housing they're going to be getting, how much is it going to cost. And these questions, they often are not adequately answered, and they're not adequately answered for years and years and years. You also have what I call a waiting for Godot effect. Anybody who's seen Waiting for Godot, you will know Vladimir and estrogen spend the whole play waiting for Godot to arrive. What happens in the case of estate regeneration, again, because of this incredibly stretched out, elongated period, is that Godot, in the form of the new, shiny buildings, never appears. You've got to remember, on lots of council estates, there are quite elderly populations. So several of the people that I interviewed, they passed away well before they were able to move into any of the new promised blocks. You also have a sort of a living in limbo phenomena, whereby people simply get exhausted, they get weary, they get fed up of the whole thing. I was at a meeting at the Aylesbury estate, and there's a tenant sitting next to me. And this is 2015, and he said, this has been going on for nearly 20 years. I'm sick of this. I just want to get on with my life. And if you think about it, and again, there was a lot of talk on the earlier session about the importance of community engagement. Yes, that's true. But let's look at this from the standpoint of the residents. Because what this means then, they are meant to be engaged. They're meant to participate, not just for a year or 2 years, for 10 years, for 20 years, for 30 years. They're expected to turn up to these terribly boring meetings to talk about the future of their homes. Well, who, apart from bonkers academics like me, and the people who are paid to do this, the officials are paid to do this, who in their right mind would want to sit in a room for 20 years discussing the future of their estate? It's simply not credible. So you also have what I call symbolic degeneration. We know that estates are stigmatised. We know this. Council estates are stigmatised in all kinds of ways. But what happens is, the irony is that once the estate begins to empty out, once you get more of the boarded up properties appearing through the regeneration degeneration process, what then happens is that the film crews arrive. Because there are lots of film crews who like shooting horror films, or they like shooting crime and antisocial behaviour TV films. The Bill used to love the Haygate years ago. And they love shooting their dystopian films on these estates. It actually adds to the stigmatisation, and residents are still living there. In the case of the Haygate estate, in a 3.5-year period from 2007 to 2010, there were 126 film shoots at that estate, most of which were actually crime-related. Films like dreadful films like Attack the Block, basically. We've seen that, Hoodies versus Aliens. So this is the reality. This is what the book's about. It's about trying to unearth what is the reality for residents to live through this process. Very, very painful, wearing, debilitating process. And one of the things that residents frequently say is this, is that, the regeneration's been going on, say, 10, 15 years. And basically the residents then will say to the officials, the local authority officials and the housing association officials, and they'll say, well, hang on a minute, what we're getting isn't what we thought we were getting. It's not what we were promised right back when you started this process 10 or 15 years ago. We were promised that we would get, new homes, we'd get better homes, etc., etc. But of course, the people who made those promises are no longer sitting in the room. They have gone off. And one of the frequent complaints from residents is they have to go attend these meetings year after year, but the people who made the original promises, they've gone off to better things, basically. So there's a fundamental lack of accountability over this dreadful regeneration, degeneration process, which elongates into the future. I mean, I've looked at estates, and there's one estate, I'm not going to name it, but there's one estate in East London which I've done a lot of work on. Regeneration was first spoken about in 2004. And the residents were pretty fed up with the condition of the block. Newham Council weren't actually improving it. They weren't properly maintaining it. They wanted something to happen. And then what happens is then the council say, okay, well, we're going to have a regeneration. We're going to have a demolition scheme. This meanders on and on and on. You get new partners coming in and coming out. So this now has been going on for 20 years. The estate has been half emptied out. So half of the tenants, leaseholders have gone. Not one single new home has been built in 20 years. So a few years ago, they had a ballot, and now the new phase of this is going to carry on. But that's not going to be completed until 2035. So the original residents will have been living through this, frankly, shit show for getting on for 30 years. And I simply don't think that the people who are doing the regeneration schemes are adequately cognizant of what it's like for people to live through this process. And that's, what I've tried to do in my book. And I've actually had comments from some people in the industry who say, yeah, you've pretty much nailed it. So.
Yeah, thanks. So as Geraldine said, I'm a council tenant on the South Kilburn estate in London Borough of Brent. And the regeneration of that estate has won lots of awards from architects and planners. I want to talk about the reality, because what we always say when we're told, oh, they've won awards, and there's a wonderful article in The Guardian saying how great the buildings are, you never talk to the people who live in and around those buildings. So there was a walkabout by an architect the other weekend because it was part of Open House Weekend. He wanted to talk about the wonderful outside of the buildings and not to talk about the inside the buildings. When I asked him, well, what proportion of the housing you built is 1, 2, 3 bedrooms? He didn't know. Are the flats bigger or smaller than the flats before? All he could talk about was the height of the ceilings, which is the least important part about the size of your flat. And that's just one architect and one of the better ones in terms of what we've had. Paul talked about promises. We were told, as part of the promises, there would be no more tower blocks in South Kilburn. Anybody who goes to South Kilburn now will see several new tower blocks. We were told we would get a new health centre. That is now 6 years late. The doctors who are supposed to have gone to that health centre are working it out of prefabs. And so it goes on in terms of the promises people have been made. You can see on the wall over there about the figures in terms of the maths and the number of houses built. The extra houses that are built, not just the replacement, the extra houses are essentially all for market sale. So literally no increase in social housing. We have already had 20 years of living on the building site. It's going to be at least another 5 years by the council's reckoning. We reckon another 10 years before they finish doing this. That is 20 years living in the building site. And to add to that, the council persuaded HS2 it was a really good idea to build their vent shaft in the middle of our estate as well. So that's another 10 years building on top of what was already going on. Obviously, demolition, rebuilding adds to climate change as well as the noise and disruption. On the quality of the housing that's built, because we're told you'll have nice new shiny houses. Actually, in terms of the quality of what's been built, one of the first blocks built under the Regeneration scheme in South Kilburn, it is costing more to put it right than it cost to build it in the first place. And the firm that built it has been given further contracts by Brent Council. There are several blocks where they've had scaffolding up for 5 years while flammable cladding is removed. There are endless stories of mould, heating problems, and so on in the flats. So in terms of quality, it's a no. It ain't happening. And in terms of the cost of the housing, I already mentioned size. We have various reports that at least some of the new builds are smaller flats than what people had before. In terms of the cost, even when people go into social housing, the service charges start to go through the roof. So even if their rent, and it's not true in most cases, but even if their rent is the same as what it was before, the service charges push up the cost massively. We have a situation where the council is basically giving away its assets, because what was essentially a council estate is now a patchwork of housing associations and market sale places. So the council has got rid of its assets. It has no further say in the future over what happens to that housing, which I think is a major problem. We have the loss of green space. What green space, I mean, lots of the green space we had has been built on, but also within the blocks that are built, they have locked green space, privatised green space, so it's no longer green space that everybody can use. That is a massive problem. At the same time, we have the council saying they're encouraging people to walk and use green space. They don't seem to notice the contradictions there. Obviously, all this is part of gentrification of the area, because we're relatively close to central London and tube lines and buses and so on. Couple of other quick points. People will talk about ballots and maybe how great it was that GLA said that future schemes have to have ballots. Our experience of that a few years ago was that they decided to ballot 17 blocks at the same time, even though residents of some of those blocks were saying, we prefer retrofitting, our blocks don't need to be demolished. Other residents of other blocks were saying, our block is shithole and it should be demolished. Bung them all together, hey presto. They also balloted temporary tenants in that ballot and told them, if you vote yes, you will get rehoused. If the ballot goes down, you won't get rehoused. They spent a fortune on that ballot. They spent 2 council officers at a time to visit tenants to persuade them to vote the right way. They even had the council CEO sitting in the consultation room, obviously the best use of her time. So ballots we're very, very sceptical of. A minor point, but Brent is quite a diverse area. We said, well, if you're going to do ballots, you've got to give people information. Do it in different languages, because we have a lot of residents whose first language isn't English. No, didn't happen. So there's a real problem there with, the supposed democratisation in terms of the ballots. Paul mentioned the sort of communication and the involvement of residents. Somebody recently complained to me that hardly anybody turns up to the consultation meetings. Well, there's an obvious reason for that. People have become so cynical that they don't get what they're promised, or the council goes ahead anyway with what it was going to do in the first place. Why should anybody go, anybody other than nutty academics or nutty activists like me? Why should anybody go to them? You can go to consultations and you say, well, what's the scale on that? Oh, the drawing's not to scale. So how can you tell what something means if you don't even get a to scale drawing of how close buildings are? There's been countless occasions, Brent and elsewhere, of people going to planning committee and saying, you're putting these 2 buildings too close, blocking out the light and so on. It just gets waved aside. We had, at the start of Regeneration in South Kilburn, an independent tenants advisor. Council got rid of him because he was too independent and saying that the scheme didn't work. So it goes on and on and on. We had corruption in the New Deal scheme, which was all over the press and everything. We have to put up with all this. I'm frequently told, there was a recent walkabout in the area of senior council officers and our new MP. But residents never get told about them. We never get invited to go along and point out the problems of the regeneration. So living in a regeneration area, demolition and rebuilding is just a continuous nightmare.
Thank you.
So I don't know. Yeah, I will do my best on that. I'm an architect by background and training, so sorry about that. But Pete was actually making me feel slightly old because I remember doing a course at Trafford Hall in Chester with a group from South Kilburn in about 2004. So I can absolutely vouch for these. You know, these things take a long time. I live in Liverpool, in central middle Liverpool, in what was a housing market renewal area, and where they filmed some of Peaky Blinders. So yeah. But in terms of the benefits, I mean, I think the thing to say about it is that they are myriad, multifaceted. There's lots and lots that retrofitting buildings well and properly touches upon. I think there has been a tendency maybe to just focus on energy, but my experience of working in retrofit schemes over the last 15 years, and the first one I did was slightly more than 15 years ago, and it was an estate regeneration scheme in North Liverpool, in Daneville, that was taking some houses that had been system built, needed structural upgrades because they were starting to fall down, wrapping them in insulation, making them warm, without the people living them having to even take their pictures down from the wall. It is not a process that is without some degree of dust and disruption. And you've got scaffolding going up, and you've got builders trampling across your garden, and sometimes damaging apple trees and things like that. It's not ideal in that respect, but it's a lot less disruptive and a lot less upsetting, I would say, than wholesale demolition programs. I think one of the reasons that I'm interested in it and have ended up working in it as an architect is I'm really interested in kind of systems thinking, or I've realised that that's kind of how my brain seems to work. I like making connections between things, and retrofit really is about making connections between things and seeking opportunities and making systems work together, whether that's about ventilation systems or about climate adaptation or about landscape systems or about heating systems. It all needs to work well together. I'm also really interested in real world impacts. Throughout my career, I've always done some degree of post-occupancy evaluation, building performance evaluation. So going back and seeing either projects I've worked on or projects that other people have worked on and seeing what the impact of those have been, whether things have worked out as intended. And there's nothing quite like retrofit for making you get real about things, because when you've got a concrete beam that you just have to deal with, or you're trying to work out an air tightness strategy for wimpy no-fines homes, which I will tell you is not much fun, but got there in the end. It is, you know, it really challenges you, but it's interesting, but you can also see some of the immediate benefits. And I think it's the speed at which it happens is quite a contrast to what has been talked about so far as well. I was involved in a social housing decarbonisation fund scheme in Leeds that I think was a part of an exhibition here maybe last year. That was the Wimpy No Fines. 190 flats. We started the design process in probably April 2021. The building work was finished by the end of 2022, if not a little bit earlier. The amount of disruption across the whole area was, you know, there was like a 9 month, I think just over 9 month build program in the end. But in each individual flat, especially by the time they got to the end of the process, the level of disruption was down to a matter of a few weeks rather than it being months and months and months. So that was a huge benefit. And then immediately as it's done, and I think Leeds, Beckett University are doing some of the post-occupancy evaluation on that, but people will talk about the benefits in terms of not just their energy bills, but also, well, I would call it indoor air quality, but places not feeling as stuffy, rooms becoming more usable, so rooms that would be neglected before because they were cold or damp got use. And people generally just, it's always hard to quantify health and well-being benefits, but I would say that the health and well-being benefits, when it's done well, are significant. The other thing, so the contractor, and this is where you come into some of the economic benefits, the contractor who is doing that work is a contractor that's specialised in retrofit over the years, and they've now got a team who are really skilled and expert and have gone on to do more, and they're able to, you know, generate local jobs, and they've got a supply chain in place that they trust. One of the biggest challenges we face in retrofit overall is finding enough people to do the work. So if it's possible to build up some of those skills and expertise through kind of well-planned, consistent, long-term retrofit programs, that will benefit the entire economy and all of us, because then people doing up their own houses might stand more of a chance of finding someone who's able to do it. And again, coming back to the systems thinking side of things, the other benefit to it was Leeds City Council in that case, one of the benefits I think to them is that they integrated the retrofit funding, which came from the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, in with their planned maintenance. So it wasn't something that was done as a add-on, stick on, oh, we've got some retrofit funding, let's just stick a few things on a wall. It was, right, we've got some retrofit funding, we need to re-roof this estate anyway, so let's combine it all, bring it all together and make it a nicer place to live, warmer, and also make it, think about the maintenance as you're doing that, and so make it resilient and into the future as well. So I will shut up there.
Brilliant, thanks Marianne. So yeah, Tom, coming to you. So we talked a bit about the sort of balloting process and the consultation process and manufacturing consent and so on. So maybe you can tell us a bit about your experience at Cressingham and the sort of methods that you've tried to employ there in terms of taking sort of to some extent resident control.
Yeah. So I lived, very recently moved from Cressingham, but I lived on Cressingham for 16 years. And in 2012, we had a residents' meeting with a council officer saying they were talking about regeneration. So there were major issues with the estate. There were difficult monetary decisions to make. And they wanted to talk with residents as under the guise of the UK's first cooperative council, whatever that meant. And nobody knew what that meant. The officers certainly didn't know what it meant. So we went, okay, we'll work with you. With completely genuine goodwill, and we thought if there's issues with the estate, like it's sliding down the hill, major structural issues or whatever, so be it. We just sort of deal with those issues, and it seemed to be the beginning of a possible positive conversation. They thought the consultation would take, I think, 6 to 10 weeks, and I've been part of that consultation process for 11 years. Nothing's been built. It was a constant process of trying to extract information out of them. There's only certain individuals that can put the time and effort to attend those meetings. I attended about 95% of those meetings over 11 years. It massively impacts your family life, your personal life. It's triggering every single time you get a letter through the door. It's like residents refer to it as like PTSD. Did you see the letter? It's like PTSD. You just sort of feel it. God, this is going to start going again. And I can feel myself welling up talking about it. I'm an artist. I don't know anything about regeneration. You know, that was my kind of thoughts. But I'll attend these meetings. I'm a middle-class person, leaseholder, living on a council estate, wanted to be part of the residents' association and learn more about my local area and the residents and everything, so I wanted to do my bit. But at every stage, when we asked for clear information, it would take months or years or never to obtain stuff. But you know, what was the decision-making to include Cressingham Gardens in the campaign? Found out it was a spreadsheet covered in the colour green with sets of numbers between 1 and 5 with no explanation of what the colours meant, what the numbers meant. And that seems to be the root of it. Or a local councillor who started telling residents, oh yeah, the estate's sliding down the hill, which it wasn't, where we went and reviewed every single survey that had been supplied. So it was just layers upon layers of nonsense. You had a party political machine. I thought I was reasonably politically engaged. I'd been on marches. I'd sort of thought, yeah, I'm a left-winger. I sort of know how authority works and everything. I didn't have a clue. I had no clue. I didn't really understand the difference between councillors and council officers and all of this kind of stuff until I was utterly subject to it. And the 300, well, actually, no, it's more than that. There's 306 properties on Cressingham. So you've probably got about 1,000 residents or something like that, maybe more. The tenants there knew the political process because they've been subject to it for years and years and years and years. There's such a depth of expertise there amongst tenants. Yet tenants can't get access to repairs data. Leaseholders can because we get our service charge bill. So you've got this sort of differentiation between what you can access. Just so happens on Cressingham, there was a lawyer that lived there. There happened to be an architect. I managed to turn my experience into a PhD. I got something out of it, which I feel quite guilty about. Happened to be a programmer. So I ended up recreating Lambeth's housing database systems and we ended up auditing every single repair on Cressingham. I found hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of repairs that were an utter nonsense. You speak to your local councillors and they start gaslighting you, bad-mouthing you in council meetings, saying, oh, he's a troublemaker. Oh, it's a middle-class white bloke that's trying to represent people here to try and shut you down. Or if you're angry at them, they say, oh, you're speaking disrespectfully. I've been to fucking 10 years of these meetings and you're trying to shut me down. You're telling me I'm angry. There's an utterly broken political system there. It eroded any sense of, there's left and right-wing politics for me. It's meaningless to me. Really, really meaningless. So as part of Cressingham, we ended up putting together an alternative to demolition, while simultaneously trying to stop the proposals. There's sham consultations where they trying to push it towards demolition and said, okay, demolition's the only option because there's no money. So we took them to judicial review and another judicial review and more judicial review. But they can only slow the process down. We tried to speak to Sadiq Khan's office. That took 4 or 5 years. And we spoke to the deputy mayor, I forget his name now, and it seemed to be no oversight. We were pointing out all of these issues, money that had been given to Lambeth, and there seemed to be no oversight of how it was spent. We spoke to higher levels of government. We applied for the right to manage and right to transfer ownership of the estate. We had a year-long monitoring. So this is all done on a voluntary basis. Now, I was doing a PhD, so I was kind of paid, not much, to put that time into it. There's no way I could have participated in that process if I didn't have a PhD. So it was left to people that are disabled on the estate or retired that could have the capacity to sort of contribute to it while they're dealing with their own struggles. So, yeah, we went through these judicial reviews. We won, we lost. But all they could do is slow things down. Put together an alternative plan to demolition, the People's Plan, which was there was genuine community support by it. That was our kind of final response to one of the consultations. We delivered it by hand, just so they couldn't pretend they didn't receive it by the deadline. And the council did everything they can to completely ignore it. So we went through the application for the right to manage, right to transfer. We were monitored by a central government official over a year-long process to assess our capabilities doing it. And that individual said, I cannot believe how this authority is behaving. It's like dealing with a bunch of teenagers. And it's impossible to tell whether it's pure incompetence, if it's corruption, which I think is absolutely there, if they're just a bit dim. There's some people that just have not got the capacity to understand all this stuff, all the terminology, all the different software systems. I made a list of 500 different software systems that they use to try and trace how are you making informed decisions? Where's this data sort of flowing? You just see this massive information. I've got hundreds of pages of timelines we've created. So it's all about wearing people out. Just makes you realise This is not a participatory democracy, you know? Sort of these decisions that are made. By the time architects are brought in, it's too late, way too late, because everything's been pre-configured up until that point. There's particular outcomes which are being pushed forward, and you feel it every time you receive a letter. And those letters would always arrive a week or 2 weeks after the date, and they'd refuse to admit, you know, so you'd have 2 days to respond to their deadline. Yeah, I had 2 children. Well, not me, my wife did, obviously, during that period, during that consultation period. They're now 8 and 10. And this consultation's still going on. I'm still part of the email threads, the WhatsApp groups and everything like that, and sort of keeping an eye on stuff. I'm not doing a PhD anymore. You know, I'm in academia. I've got a job to do, and I'm trying to sort of get back into it. But it's really difficult to sort of participate in that process. And I think I was saying earlier, the really difficult thing is so difficult to communicate how complex all this stuff is and what that lived experience is. And people just don't get it. You need hours to talk it through. You have to become an expert in so many different domains and different disciplines to even have a chance of sort of talking through this stuff. And what happens over those 10, 20, 30 years, it's the residents actually that know most about that process by far. They know the detail of those sort of decisions. Yet each new round of council officer, you know, career politician, or whatever, rocks in, gets what they can and moves on. You know, perhaps I'm guilty of that as well. I'm in academia now, so my PhD was about Cressingham and that experience of it. So, yeah, I mean, that kind of gives quite a good summary, I think, of just how crap it is.
Well, so to sort of segue from the crap to the how we might be slightly less crap. Kate, you had some good examples of some case studies that you'd found which were doing things slightly differently, which are looking at retrofit schemes. So maybe you want to sort of share a little bit of those, as well as perhaps your own experiences of Lambeth housing with your own buildings.
Is this thing working? Brings back all sorts of painful memories for me, because I did work for Lambeth in the days when Cressingham Gardens was designed and built. And it was an absolutely marvellous team of architects we had there. And Ted Hollenby, the chief architect, was particularly committed to Cressingham Gardens as an illustration of everything he stood for. And the fact that Lambeth is now embarked on the course of trying to destroy that legacy is really a sort of patricide, that they're devouring the treasures that Hollenby created. In fact, the scheme I did for Lambeth is one of only 2 buildings of that era which have been listed. The other one being Brixton Recreation Centre, which was, the main designer was my late partner. And my scheme was sheltered housing for the elderly in the days when that was the cutting edge philosophical idea of the best and most dignified way to provide accommodation for old people so that they could enjoy as much independence as they were capable of handling, but that help was always on hand. I got an appeal for help from the daughter of one of the residents because Lambeth had decided that they were going to demolish the scheme and sell off the site. And the residents were so happy living there, which was a big heart warmer to me, that they wanted to resist this by any means possible. And they asked my advice as to what to do. So I advised them to go for listing. I didn't actually have a very optimistic view of what our chances of success would be. But together with experts in the field, we put in the application to Historic England, and it was supported by all manner of big-name architects, including several former presidents of the RIBA, and a deputation of the residents themselves delivered it by hand to Historic England. And in 2015, spring of that year, we got the news that it had been listed Grade 2. So we had a sort of celebratory party and thought, oh, this is wonderful now. The sun comes out and everything will be lovely. Lambeth councillors sent a rather disgruntled letter to all the residents saying, well, you may think this scheme's worth something, but we disagree with you as far as we're concerned. It's a load of rubbish. However, they did vote about $1.5 million for carrying out the necessary backlog of repairs, 40 years of neglect. So more celebration, more optimism, but not a bit of it. In 2018, I got another SOS, Kate, come to site, shoddy work going on. And the listing had particularly mentioned the carefully controlled block work of the external walls. It was written into the contract there was to be no block cutting. There was nobody on-site cutting. So everything was set out on the module of these blocks. And there, lo and behold, I found a great complex arrays, spaghetti junctions of pipe work going up over these walls and holes being drilled willy-nilly, some of them in the wrong places. Then they would just leave the hole and move on, drill another hole. In one case, they wrote off someone's bespoke microwave in the process of doing this, never warned the residents when they were going to turn up or what the work was going to be. These elderly, frail people are living on a building site, some of them having open wounds to be dressed, and their care workers turning up and saying, no, I can't work here. This is unsanitary, I'm going away. It was an absolute mayhem because they had let it as 2 design and build contracts with absolutely no coordination, no site of work, clerk of works, of course, on site. And when I went and saw this great spaghetti array of pipes, which were all illegal, contrary to the protection, took a photograph and went into this site meeting, showed them the photograph and said, who the hell agreed to this? This is totally illegal. And their jaws all dropped. They did not know what they had let themselves in for. There was no drawings. There was only written specification. They had no idea what the consequences of their own decisions were going to be. The battle goes on.
Okay, well, maybe not so much of getting any better. So, I mean, I wonder whether the panel have got any immediate comments, although possibly maybe the thing to do would be to go out to the audience to have some experiences, because I think it's kind of key thing at the moment. We've got a lot of people here.
Don't you want my positive example?
Well, I would like your positive example. Yes, okay. I thought you'd finished. Please start. Let's kick off the positive then. Go for it.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm from Scotland, you may know, but so this is a Scottish example. It's Glasgow. It's the reclad and upgrade of 3 wood side 22-storey slab blocks, also known as cedar towers. And the architect in charge is Collective Architecture. It It's quite near the Glasgow Ring Road. So if you drive around the Glasgow Ring Road, you'd see them. And their aim was to realise, which they have achieved, 80% energy saving and passive house standard. The client team at Queen's Cross Housing Association undertook a complex and genuine consultation. It was complex because there were 32 different languages spoken amongst the residents. Their original presupposition was that they were going to demolish these blocks, but they found, as a result of this consultation, that the residents liked living there. So they changed tack, and now they have 315 homes, social homes, making a substantial contributions to Glasgow's social housing stock. There are 105 flats in each of the blocks. The reclad included the enclosure of former balconies, and the triple glazing of the windows. The tenants have controlled ventilation and there are thermal collectors on the roof. And all the tenants remain in residence as in Grand Park, Bordeaux, which of course helped with the balance sheet because they were collecting the rents all the time. And they've got new lifts, they've got improved dual side communal access, which didn't exist before, and improved landscaping, and all at the bargain price of $40,000 per dwelling.
I mean, I work for an organisation that's called People Powered because we kind of think that retrofit is a big problem and it's going to need all of us to tackle it in some way. But imagine what would happen if all of that energy that's been spent fighting demolition was put into some of the stuff you're doing. I think it is like similar to what some of the things we've talked about. There are problems when things are looked at in isolation. So when you look at homes as units on a spreadsheet, or when you look at installing an internal wall insulation system without considering the ventilation or the thermal bridging or all the other things that need to go alongside it. And there have been things that have been introduced over the years because that has been recognised. So we're just about to have, for the first time ever, a British standard for how you go about actually assessing a home to do retrofit properly. And that it covers, it's not just about energy, it's about ventilation, moisture, heritage, everything, occupancy, as they call it. Feels a bit sterile. But I think that's all to the good. But the thing, and what sounds like you've already fought a little bit against as well, is the problems with the way that some of the funding is set up, and it becomes a barrier for people like your organisation to access it. I'm in a co-op as well, and like engaging with some of these large organisations is just super difficult. But also it's kind of the system. So ECO is the energy company obligation. And the way that it works is that the biggest energy companies are expected to do a certain level of retrofit energy efficiency work everywhere to achieve a certain level of carbon savings. And they're incentivized in some way to do that because if they don't meet their targets, they get fined. And then the money goes into a pot that's called the Energy Redress Fund. And actually, I would encourage you to apply for that one because that is one that community groups can get to. But I think the whole structure is a bit crock because it's basically, and that's why one of the people who you were talking to said they were out of a job, because what tends to happen is that eco contracts will get let, they'll run for so long. Some of the big energy companies will say, actually, this is too much like hard work now, we'll just cancel the rest and take the fine this year. And then that means that people who had been working as designers or installers or doing, electricians and things working on, thought that they had stable work to do. It's all very stop-start. So it means we never build up the capacity and the skills to be able to roll this stuff out effectively because it's all the way that the funding and the contracts have been set up basically disincentivizes that, which is super annoying.
Anybody else want to comment on that, or should we have another question from the audience?
I've been trying to deliver retrofit in a London housing authority. I won't name them, and for 4 years found that fairly challenging. So, kind of observations. I suppose one, what social housing is for. I look back at films in the 50s with GPs living in Churchill Gardens. So social housing has become housing of last resort, and that's really skewed the population. At one point, it was aspirational. I think the architects who built social housing in the 60s were wanting to build housing that was better than private sector equivalents. But unfortunately, since the 70s, and certainly the 80s, when it started to have right to buy, it's become increasingly the housing of last resort. And that skewed the population. People are encouraged, if you're socially aspirational, living in social housing is a death knell kind of, and that's created a kind of sink estates. And unfortunately, many inner London boroughs, for either incompetence or lack of resources or the scale of the problem, have just not been able to manage the huge amount of stock that they've got. And sadly, I've seen more slum-like conditions of damp and mould in council-owned and managed properties. And I think we're in a real state because of that. The other thing that's really come in the last 2 years, we've always relied on cheap energy with our housing. We live in a maritime climate, which is not too cold in winter, not too hot in summer. And we've always had cheap energy sources. Gas went up by 5-fold, and that's just the price councils pay for gas. And of course, people have stopped putting the heating on, which has just exacerbated the damp and mould, because you've got cold surfaces, damp and mould forms there. And as a result, these houses become nearly uninhabitable. So I think we've just got to rethink what social housing is for, who's living in it. Perhaps also look at the compact. So actually, it's not just for the social rent, but there's a certain allowance for the heat and hot water. And if that's then done collectively, you might get greater efficiencies in terms of not every individual having an individual gas boiler. So there's a real shift needed if we are going to change. And then if we're going to even think about getting our stock to net zero, and I've been banging my head against the wall for 4 years and got absolutely nowhere, it just is so hard. So I think I don't want to be kind of disappointing about it, because there are some great schemes like the towers you referred to in Glasgow, but it's a huge problem, and I don't think we've really got politicians or people with the capacity to really understand what's required. Just
to say that one of the other things that makes it hard is some of the data that our assumptions about carbon savings in some of these programs is based on is highly questionable, because you're looking at something like an energy performance certificate that doesn't account for people underheating, which they are. So,
yeah, I'm slightly the argument that social council housing was the tenure of last resort, which is the classic sort of residualisation argument. It's one of the points I make in my book. I don't actually think it was in some ways, but it wasn't from the standpoint of working class Londoners, because I mean, this is pretty consistent amongst the elderly people that I interviewed who had lived in private renting. This is, it's even worse now, is that they regarded private renting as the tenure of last resort, because it was A, insecure, and B, expensive. And many people told me stories of, simply, random landlords doing all kinds of awful things, basically. So I think the structural issue, and this goes right the way, it's terribly boring, but it goes right the way back to the Conservative governments from 79 to 97, was the £19 billion worth of repairs that were clocked up in the social housing sector. New Labour, unfortunately, when they came in, instead of actually giving the money to the councils directly to actually address the huge problems that councils had, particularly in London, instead, New Labour set up this terribly convoluted governance system, which was that, yes, councils were instructed to meet the decent home standards, but there's no direct money for that. And instead, councils were given these three options. One, stock transfer to a housing association. Secondly, set up a PFI, We know about PFIs now. And then thirdly was introducing ALMA, an arms management organisation. But again, if you look at the story on decent homes, and again in London, was that the whole thing was so complex, and so you still had many councils at the end of the programme that still hadn't been the decent homes, and Londoners were suffering as a result of that. So I think the macro political economic context has been terribly unfavourable. And again, if you think about the comparison, say, between the different parts of the welfare state, the NHS, universalistic part of the welfare state, 95% of the population use it, very mainly. Council housing has always been the working class part of the welfare state. And I think that's probably one of the fundamental reasons why it's actually been marginalised, really, within the Whitehall and the yeah.
Residents living in the White House and a mixed community. I think the Camden Council commissioned that with 100% social housing. Like most London estates, 30% of those houses have now been sold off, and they're being sold for $1 million plus. And actually, like me, you want to live in London, you're possibly living in former local authority housing. That's nothing's choice. So London is leading that now. And the demographic shift when I mean, whereas everyone was moving out, everyone wants to live. That's the pressure on land, particularly on the land on such land is right next to land, like 40% in the land is only that's a huge, there's often a question of what we do.
That's one of the big issues around retrofitting versus demolition, is the way that demolition and rebuilding, it often means a loss of that public land, either through some sort of long-term lease or actually selling the land to the developers. Whereas that's one of the great pluses about retrofitting is you keep the land. Look at the councils, keep the land.
Could I come in on this? Of course, none of this happened by accident. Ever since Thatcher's came to power, the Conservatives have had this prime objective of shrink the state and privatisation. And one of the tools that they used to corral local authorities into disposing of their assets, and notably, most importantly, their land, was just to starve them of funds, so that now more than 50% of the land which was in public ownership in 2079 is now in private hands. And if you take that together with the shredding of the welfare state, then the perception cultivated in the general public is security through acquiring assets, primarily, of course, a home. But that is a one-time only offer, because the stock of social housing available to be sold off under right to buy is shrinking all the time, and the incentive to try to replace it while right to buy still exists is evaporatingly small. So that what you're left with is indeed a residualization of the least desirable aspects of what was produced in the heyday of the 60s and 70s. In Lambeth, it certainly was the policy, and the housing manager actually articulated this to me, to build an excess way beyond the requirements of those people sitting on the housing list, so that they could let at economic rents to whoever preferred secure tenancy at a reasonable rent, so that you would not get the stigma, any stigma attached to living in social housing because they would be mixed communities. But of course, that objective was never, ever realised.
There was a question at the back.
Hi, I'm an architect and I'm sort of very well aware of being in the room with the developer and discussing sort of estate regeneration, retrofit. I think tonight's made very clear about the sort of social imperative for retrofitting, but the sort of the scale and the speed that we need to retrofit at in terms of the climate emergency. I'd like just to sort of ask the panel in terms of some of the financial incentives for retrofitting. I recently heard about the Energy Sprong model and whether there's any more sort of radical financial or economic models, you know, in terms of trying to get retrofit sort of much broader.
Well, then, Kate, yeah.
There is a wonderful upscaled model of retrofit in Sheffield where Annalise Richards and what's the other half of the they've been retrofitting this huge estate. Park Hill. They're now on to the second stage of it. You may have seen it was dramatised on the National Theatre, standing at the sky's edge. Regrettably, it's that scheme also was up for demolition, but it was listed, and that saved it. And they've gone to enormous lengths and very careful studies to improve the sustainable aspects of the scheme, but in that it's a commercial venture. Only a very small proportion of it is so-called economic rents, not social rents. But it is possible to upscale if given the right financial support.
I suppose just quickly, is your question about the technical kind of methodologies or the financial? Because those are two sort of different issues, really. I mean, the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund is centrally government funded. I mean, we discussed that a little bit earlier today. It's not very much, and it has to be sort of
it has to be matched.
Matched, yeah.
Usually, but matching against maintenance budgets is not a bad idea.
So, I'm not an architect, so really I know, you know, I've been subject to regeneration, so I've picked up a little bit. And the thing that seems to be really absent is care and maintenance, which avoids a lot of the issues that you end up with. And what will happen in Lambeth, they can retrofit as much as they like, and those buildings will degrade because there's an inability to maintain and repair. There are not caretakers, and I mean that in the broadest sense of the word. Residents aren't empowered to be caretakers. You know, they care, and we care about the buildings. We want them repaired. You can see the issues. But you end up going through layers and layers and layers of all these contractors and subcontractors. And you see that with Grenfell. I think there was a database put together which had 6 million documents relating to repairs and maintenance of just one tower. There's a ex-council officer that I chatted to who in Lambeth who said he used to keep an eye on 300 homes. So, you know, sort of a small estate, mid-sized estate. Now it's more like 1,000, 1,500 is the norm. Doesn't actually cost that much to put a bit more staffing there and to see off the problems from the outset. Because otherwise you're just literally throwing money away. I had just as one small example. Our home on Cressingham started to have a buzz. It was really keeping my wife awake at night. Very sensitive hearing. And it was just this very deep hum. I worked out it was a street lamp attached to our wall, and it was buzzing. So I got the special screwdriver, unscrewed it, unscrewed the light bulb, and screwed up the cover. The buzz came back because somebody had screwed the light bulb in, and that happened about 4 or 5 times. And I kept saying, you need to replace the light bulb. Each visit, Lambeth would charge £450 to screw in a light bulb. You know, when you've got that kind of corruption going on, you don't eradicate that, then these issues are just going to repeat and repeat and repeat themselves. And that, yeah.
And I'll just quickly come in on your point about the funding. I mean, if the St Raphael's Estate exercise that we looked at identified that by adding additional housing, you could actually offset the costs of the retrofit on one estate alone. So, you know, just that quite simply in terms of cross-subsidisation is entirely possible on a single estate like St Raphael's. So, but the councils aren't pursuing that. So that's one of the problems.
I think that the other thing that I'd add that's kind of quite interesting and people are just starting to look at is the grid's becoming really quite constrained, and especially in some parts of London. At the moment, the district network operators aren't allowed to do anything on the other side of the meter, but it would be in their interests to be able to put some money or some support behind doing some retrofit work rather than having to build new substations, new generation. And there are people who are looking at those kind of issues again, which again, like it's about thinking about the whole thing as a system and doing the maintenance properly and making it all work together rather than seeing things as like atomized pots of money that you have to, yeah.
Okay, I mean, I spoke earlier on, and I don't know if there's some of the same people here from the first time, but I'll try not to repeat too much, and I would like to take on extra stuff. I mean, first of all, I mean, there's a lot of dishonesty, obviously, we know within politics. I feel that there's too much, well, there's a kind of play on words, that semantics, that what councils are saying that they're doing and what they really are doing are two very separate things. And I'll just give an example. So, for example, I'm losing my thread here. I've been here too long, I think. Oh, affordable. That big word, affordable. There is never an absolute overriding definition of what it means. If you ask the GLA what affordable means, their definition is anything that is built with subsidy. That means shared ownership for households on income, an income up to 90,000. That is included as affordable, which is complete nonsense. Okay, so I've seen a document recently that has come up with a definition of affordable using the UN Habitat definition, which is that no household should have to spend more than 30% of its income on housing. That would be their definition of affordable. And if you translate that, I happen to be a Lambeth resident, so I know all about Lambeth. The average household income in Lambeth is £38,000. So if you work that out, it comes out that £950 a month, anything above that is unaffordable. You're lucky to find, certainly in the private renters sector, anything kind of below that. And anything that is built that is new is way above that. Because as soon as you build new, it's more expensive to rent and to buy. So there is a question of semantics and how they play with words. The GLA also even has a definition. They had funding to build more council homes for Londoners in 2018. And on their fact sheet, it said, what is the definition of council housing, or council homes, sorry. And it said, anything in the affordable range, again, that is built by councils or by a council-owned special purpose vehicle, like the once Homes for Lambeth, that is deemed as a council home, and that includes shared ownership. Okay, that is problematic. So when we see all the figures about we're building so many council homes, that will include shared ownership, which is complete and utter nonsense. So getting on to the demolition of estates, like in Lambeth, they're proposing, Stills are proposing the demolition of 6 council estates. 3 of them are under review, but 3 of them they're pretty much still kind of proposing to do. And I suppose what we've been trying, I'm part of a group called Refurbish, Don't Demolish, so that kind of tells you where I'm coming from. What we've been asking of the council, because their proposals to demolish estates came in about 2012, it was way before they had come out as a council declaring a climate emergency. Everything has changed since 2012, or certainly it should have done, and yet they haven't changed their policy. In some cases, they've actually doubled down and got even worse. They're being advised by the likes of Savills, who have their own kind of monetary interests to exploit the, private rentals and private for sale. They're being advised by these people to go ahead with the demolition. Savills know that councils do not have the level of expertise to manage all the projects that they're asking them to undertake. They've written as much. They shouldn't do more than 2 projects, and yet they encouraged Lambeth to do 6, and they can't manage it. Okay, so up here it says proposals for policy change. So my proposal for policy change. At the moment in Lambeth, we have 6 estates which are near empty. A lot of people have already, I live near an estate called South Lambeth Estate. Is 101 properties. Most of the people have actually moved out, moved into the decamp block, or if they're leaseholders, a lot of them have already sold up and left. So that estate is almost empty. That is the best time to retrofit. When the homes are empty, you don't have the problem of leaseholder buy-in and having to kind of pay a proportion of the cost of the retrofit. So I had a petition which I brought, funnily enough, here last year, asking Lambeth to use the empty properties to help train up a retrofit task force that is employed by the council. So they have their own in-house expertise, which is something they really don't have. So that they don't have to go to all these private contractors and subcontractors, so much waste of money. And by doing that, I scrunched the figures. I kind of worked it out that if they just retrofitted South Lambeth Estate alone, because they'd had to buy back so many leasehold properties, they'd end up with more extra council homes than the entire 6 estate regeneration programme, which they said would only generate about 40 extra council homes. That is the proposal for the policy change, but it needs a major change it needs a government will. Obviously, the funding needs to come through, but we need people to be trained up with the skills to retrofit. If the money was there tomorrow, there wouldn't be enough people to do it. So, just join the dots a bit.
Thank you. Thank you for your policy proposal. So we only have a few more minutes. So some questions or some comments that involve policy proposals for change, please. Okay, man over there and...
Hi, so policy proposals change, but also an answer to the architect that I can't see who asked about funding models, because funding models for mass housing decarbonisation is my job. So I think you have to be realistic. So there are about 4.5 million social housing homes in the UK. Kate, you talked about a project in Glasgow, it's about 40,000 a unit. In the earlier panel, we had someone from Portsmouth who talked about 120,000 per unit. Let's pick 50 grand as an average budget. That's 250 billion pounds of funding that we need. The Warm Homes Social Housing Fund, SHDF Wave 3, is 1.3 billion. So it's half a drop in a bucket. It's a huge amount of money. Best will in the world, no politician has got £250 billion hanging around in their pocket to pay for this. Yeah, potentially, but the point is you have to look at what value are we creating. So stop looking at this as a cost. There is a huge reduction in energy bills. Now, across the entire UK built environment, we need to be able to harness those energy bill savings to pay for it, so people aren't putting money in up front. Obviously, a lot harder in social housing. We're dealing with fuel poverty, but we don't have the luxury of a binary where all of the energy saving goes to all residents. It's just not possible in the numbers. But we also have to look at the other benefits. So there's a comment in the earlier panel about reduced policing costs when you retrofit an estate. If you're living in a flat with mold and damp, you are going to cost the health service money because you're going to be ill. So if you start thinking about all of the benefits that flow from it, you have to create a collective model to do this as cheaply as possible. And that means moving away from a property by property approach to a collective approach. We need economies of scale. And so this kind of approach has parallels with Energy Sprong, as you mentioned. We've been developing a model called the Net Zero Neighbourhood. That's being tested at the moment by West Mids Combined Authority, by Bristol City Council, and by Hounslow here in London. But it's a long-term project to work out how to do this in a totally different way than we've done it before. There unfortunately is no, unless anyone's got £500 billion hanging around, there isn't a quick fix to this, unfortunately.
It's a question of long-term investment and thinking of this as an infrastructure, housing as infrastructure, rather than as...
Thinking about housing as a component of community infrastructure, along with community assets, green infrastructure, transport infrastructure, and investing in that as a... we have a productivity problem in this country. We have had for 15 years. I wonder why.
One last question here.
No, I'm sorry. Yeah. James? There? You had more question? No.
Well, don't think it was as interesting as the last question. I think it was a really good question. But I suppose just listening to sort of the history, really, we're in a different paradigm to where we were in the 1960s and 70s, and in many ways we might wish ourselves back there, because these problems that have sort of happened as a result of deregulation and sort of the fragmentation, really, we're not going to get back there. And I suppose we have to deal with the world we're in. I've lived in I was a leaseholder on a Southwark estate for many, many years. I was also director in charge of Wilmcote House. So, I know what worked there, but they had their hands tied subsequently after the project. But at that window of opportunity, they had the money, they had a plan, they weren't desperately reliant on funding, and they could see that what they were doing had a long-term benefit. But I suppose that window is fleeting, really, and all the rent caps and everything that's happened since is sort of preventing that happening. And the hollowing out of a lot of local authorities has that lack of knowledge and lack of finance has really been detrimental. So I think the finance is kind of the situation we're living with, but I think the building up of local authority teams is really, really important, because I work with lots of local authorities. Some of them shall remain nameless, have been mentioned tonight. And there's a huge variety in terms of capacity to deliver a project. And that money isn't everything. It's the ability to manage your own assets. And sometimes, all the issues that were mentioned really chime with my experience. It's not a question, sorry, it's an observation.
Should we just take one last question here, and then we'll come back to the panel? Do you want to wait for the mic?
Really? it's, I think, so much down to what you were saying, scale, but using the assets of the people. In East Ayrshire, they've got now a really good relationship with Dalmellington, which is an ex-mining community. And the people there went about working out what they needed, and they got a responsive council. It's always been Labour, Left, SNP. And the same goes for the old people's homes. They now don't wait for the council to come in with any of the kit. They sort it out themselves. They pretty much say, council, we need this and we need it now, and how are we going to get it? And they handle the money pretty much. Now, I don't have much detail, but I just know that East Ayrshire, look out for it, because I think it's doing great stuff, because they are humble and serving much more. And all you talk about here is so much this hierarchy, this impossible hierarchy. It's much more horizontal, and there's no more selling of councils' houses up in Scotland. That's what I was going to say.
It always gets my back up when the word unit is used instead of home, and all this language about assets and things like that. It's people's homes that we're dealing with. I think that's a really important shift. On Cressingham and other estates, on Grenfell, the amount of money generated through rents far exceeded what was spent on maintenance and repairs. You know, we have this dialogue of there's no money, we can't afford this, that and the other. Maybe I'm not clever enough to understand the financial models, or maybe a lot of the financial models employed within this are overly complex and pointing at precisely the wrong kinds of things. Because at a local level, you can see where there is excess finance, you know? I'm not at a level of an entire city or an entire government, but at the local level, there is an excess, without a doubt. And so I think that needs to be sort of thought about, and that's about sort of perhaps devolution of powers and authorities, and stop looking at people as numbers.
Just a couple of points. I mean, on one of the many problems with demolition, it's claimed that sort of demolition pays for new homes. But one of the drawbacks is developers use that model to drive down the proportion of social housing that is part of that development. Yeah. That's something that is a cost in terms of what we can do. I mean, the housing we need is social housing. The people who are homeless or on waiting lists don't need those market for sale properties. They need social housing. That has to be the priority. In terms of a policy, it's an old policy, but it's one that's very relevant, is putting at the centre of housing, whether it's retrofit, demolition or anything else, the people who are going to live in it. One of the many things that the Grenfell inquiry came up with is Kensington Chelsea Council was ignoring the fact that tenants were raising problems about that housing. And it wasn't just the cladding. It was things like access for vehicles, for fire engines and so on. And Kensington Chelsea is by no means unique in that. Tenants, residents need to be at the centre of those discussions. That means real consultation, not token consultation, not tick boxes. The last consultation around our regeneration is supplementary report, supplementary master plan, 180-page document, thick with architects and planners jargon, nobody to assist residents, tenants to understand what it was all about. But that was what we were supposed to absorb, and that's the sort of documents we're expected to absorb. So residents need to be at the centre of things. They need to be involved at every stage, discussed with at every stage. That cynicism would disappear if people felt that they were being listened to and they were having a real say in what was happening on their housing.
So I'm just going to start the finishing up. Just by an example of a good recent housing policy change that came about. So some of you, if not all of you, may know about it, but in 2020, the GLA changed the funding for new social homes on estate regeneration schemes, which previously they would have given funding for every new social rented home on that estate, which included the replacement of demolished homes. In 2020, that was changed, and so they no longer funded the construction of a replacement of a demolished home. So there are really, really specific policies that can make really, really radical changes. And that moment on, the full demolition schemes became fundamentally considerably unviable. And so there was a sort of a shift from 2020 onwards in terms of what made an estate regeneration scheme viable. And funnily enough, since then, more and more schemes are being looked at as retrofit schemes. So there was a shift at that point. And I think it is really important to believe that there are very specific policy changes that we can make that can have really significant changes. And I don't think it's all impossible at all. So to our panel here for a hopeful end to some changes.
Just to respond to the idea that you can't go back to the 60s and 70s, but if you look at the scale of the crisis now, there are something like 80,000 households in temporary accommodation across the country, 60,000 in London alone, 150,000 children. So you're probably talking about 200,000, 250,000 people. There is no possibility, absolutely no possibility on this God's earth that those people can be helped into home ownership. It ain't going to happen. There has to be a real step up in terms of social housing, provision, production, and stop demolishing the stock we've already got. And it really requires a kind of political imagination in relationship to thinking about, you've got there's a small town of people currently living in temporary accommodation. Those people, I've interviewed lots of people in temporary accommodation. It's often terrible circumstances. They've moved around between different flats. Their kids are disrupted. They've got health issues, etc., etc., etc. So what it requires it does require a national Marshall Plan to address this problem. I mean, Angela Rayner's made these kind of like fuzzy comments about, we're going to build enough social housing, the most social housing for a generation. But there's no figures. No figures. The only figure they've got is the 1.5 million homes. And that all seems to be underpinned in relationship to home ownership. So there really has to be this political sea change in how housing is thought about and how those 250,000 people are going to be housed, properly housed. This is a rich country.
I'd just like to point out the housing benefit is currently £15.6 billion a year. That's every year, 15.6 billion. So your figure, I can't remember exactly what it was. But if we do think of this as an investment, this is 15.6 billion pounds going straight from the public purse into private hands.
Exactly.
This is, and if we really start to understand in much longer, much broader terms.
A 20-year investment programme.
Yeah, exactly. 20-year investment, and then we've sorted it.
Can I ask a question about policy, just in relation to that? The reduction we've seen over the last, 30, 40 years in the number of social housing homes has been matched by a rise in the number of private rental homes. And policy has clearly made it easy to, if you have access to capital, to become a rent, whatever the word is, basically renting stuff out at really poor quality.
Slum landlord.
Exactly, right. Is part of the solution here policy that makes it harder and less attractive to be a landlord? And we see, so not just building new social homes, but it's reclaiming often ex-social homes back into the public sector.
I mean, and partly that is an issue of rent control as well, which has been ruled out. Sadiq Khan has been told, no, we won't bring in rent controls in London. I mean, not far from our estate, not part of the estate regeneration, there are old townhouses. You look at them, and there are 16 bells outside, a two-story building. I mean, and those are not let out cheaply. There has to be a crackdown on that sort of housing, from local councils, from central government, and so on. What we need, as Paul said, is social housing. To the question of money, well, partly the answer is after the Second World War, we didn't have money and they managed to build up the welfare state. My other answer, I'm sorry, is we have money and it's in the wrong hands.
Totally agree with that.
Okay, sorry. Sorry. just to that point, it is really about priorities and what we prioritize and where we spend our time and our money and our efforts, because, you know, life is short. And I think if we were able to put some of those efforts into addressing what is a really bloody serious issue in the climate emergency, rather than pretending that doesn't exist and carrying on as if, it, you know, as we did before, that was as widely known. I think to the point about people and putting people at the heart of it, I would really recommend some work by a colleague of mine, a couple of colleagues of mine at Carbon Co-op called Retrofit for All. They've done some work, they're doing further work about in retrofit programs, which sometimes suffer from the same issues of not caring enough about the people as some of the demolition programs and estate regeneration programs do. They've set out a template, a toolkit for how you could do that better. And all right, yeah, frameworks, toolkits, all of these things, similar to some of the standards around quality in retrofit as well, the past 2035 standard, all of that stuff exists, but what actually really matters is how the people doing the work apply it, and you have to mean it and care about it. And yeah, I suppose the other thing, just to say finally, things like the minimum energy efficiency standard, they're coming in for private renting, but again, you can play that system to a degree. There are lots of get-out clauses, so this is something that requires private landlords to meet a certain level of energy performance certificate. Energy performance certificates themselves, fairly questionable in terms of what they do. Fundamentally, I think what we need to be doing we can set up all these standards, set up all these systems. What we also need to be doing is thinking about ownership, where the money is, and how we deal with things like procurement and how contracts are managed, because that's kind of where these things really impact.
For me, I don't know how you create a policy out of the list of things I'm going to say, but a wish list really is to detach from short-term party political point scoring sort of structures and systems at a local level. Have expertise for estates and for communities sort of dealing with these kinds of issues. It's too much to put all this on a few individuals' shoulders. It's deeply, deeply unfair and undemocratic. Pay residents for their participation. They're doing a bloody job. Binding decisions, which ties into functional independent oversight. Every layer of government washes their hands when it starts to go wrong. So you need actually oversight with teeth. The Housing Ombudsman is kind of starting to do something and has highlighted Lambeth as an issue, a really big issue, one of the biggest in the country, I think. There we go. They're not doing anywhere near enough. And functional care, maintenance and repair, which I think is at the absolute core of it. Care of people, care of buildings, care of environment.
Since during the last 15 years, the block grant from central government to local government has been cut by at least 40%, and this is unequally distributed so that those areas with the greatest need get the biggest cuts. Those which vote Tory, of course, are let off lightly. We are the most centralised administration in the whole of Europe, and it's been increasing, that centralisation. So until you get real power and real funding to local government, you won't get the incentive for good, honest, public people wishing to serve the public good going into local government. They'll always have some hidden motive, how they can use the system to their own ends. I think that's one of the diseases. And until local government is reinvigorated, people will mistrust it, and rightly so, because it's just becomes a foil, a fob, a phony process to persuade people they're being consulted when they're not. They're discounted.
So no more policy. No, nothing to say, Paul.
Just, I talked about the way that estate regeneration takes decades, but there is a contrast to this. Because if you look at the estate scheme, the regeneration schemes that were done back in the 1990s, they were done on a much smaller scale, much shorter time scale. So, for example, if you take the Comprehensive Estates Initiative in Hackney, that was done at 5 estates, 5,500 homes. They did some demolition. They did a lot of rebuilding. They reduced the stock overall to 4,500. But nevertheless, that scheme was much, much bigger than the schemes that I looked at, like Woodbury Down or Clapham Park. But they did it in 10 years, the whole thing, kit and caboodle. So there's something about the public-private partnership model of estate regeneration, whereby you do get the private sector in, the developers in to help you out with the financial heavy lifting, and basically they slow it down. It's slowed down. It has to be slowed down because they can't shove hundreds of homes onto the market at the same time. So actually, the private sector, in relationship to the production of estate regeneration, is highly inefficient. Is the private sector, public money, counter-cyclical money, that's where you could actually do things properly. But if you get these very, very complex public-private partnerships, very, very competing agendas between the private sector, the public sector, it ain't going to happen. And it drags out, and drags out with all of the kind of degenerative effects that I've illustrated.
I'd like to just mention the obscenity of buy to leave. The number of homes which have remained empty for more than 6 months is roughly equal to the number of families living in B&Bs and other unsuitable accommodation.
So on that relatively positive solution-based note, I would like to thank you all very much for coming. I'd like to thank our panellists, Kate Macintosh, Tom Keane, Marianne Heaslip, Pete Firmin, and Paul Watt, and you all for coming and joining us for the discussion this evening. Thank you very much.